The morning sun poured through the massive glass windows of Terminal C at the Seattle International Airport. It was a bright day, one of those rare mornings when the sky looked freshly washed and endless. Passengers hurried through the terminal, juggling coffees, luggage, and their buzzing phones, barely noticing the world around them. Among the crowd was a frail-looking old woman, her gray hair neatly pinned, her back slightly bent under the weight of a small travel bag. Her name was Margaret Hayes, though no one bothered to ask. She wore a faded beige cardigan, sensible shoes, and carried a leather handbag that looked older than some of the passengers boarding with her. As she reached the gate for Flight 742 to Denver, the attendant gave her a polite, mechanical smile, the kind reserved for the elderly who needed extra assistance. Margaret simply nodded, producing her boarding pass with steady hands. Her ticket read, Row 3, Seat A. The plane wasn't full yet, and as Margaret shuffled down the aisle, her steps slow but deliberate, a few passengers turned to look. A young man in his 20s whispered to his girlfriend, "Aw, look, someone's grandma's flying alone." The girl giggled softly, whispering back, "Hope she doesn't faint if we hit turbulence." Their laughter followed her as she reached her seat. Margaret didn't react. She placed her handbag under the seat, adjusted her cardigan, and sat quietly by the window. Her eyes, sharp, intelligent blue, scanned the tarmac outside, watching as ground crew moved with precision around the aircraft. The rhythmic coordination of their movements brought a faint smile to her lips. She had seen it all before, from a very different perspective. As the plane began to fill, a group of business travelers took their seats nearby. The man in the aisle seat next to her, wearing an expensive suit and too much cologne, noticed the worn pilot's pin on her lapel. He smirked. "Cute pin," he said sarcastically, glancing at her. "You a fan of aviation or something?" Margaret turned her head slowly, her voice calm and measured. "Something like that," the man chuckled. "My dad used to collect those. Bet you got that from some old souvenir shop, huh?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the window again, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the pin, a tiny golden pair of wings, slightly tarnished but still gleaming faintly in the sunlight. The flight attendants went about their pre-flight duties, their practiced smiles and efficient gestures hiding the fatigue of long hours. Margaret observed every detail. How one attendant double-checked the emergency exit, how the captain's voice came through the intercom with a cheerful announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 742 to Denver. This is Captain Roger Dean speaking." The sound of that name hit her like a quiet thunderclap. Captain Roger Dean. She hadn't heard it in decades, but it was impossible to forget. He had once been her student, young, eager, a bit reckless, but talented. The corners of her lips lifted slightly. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Margaret closed her eyes for a brief moment. The familiar hum of the engines filled her chest with nostalgia. It wasn't fear she felt, and it was recognition. Every vibration, every pitch of sound was a language she once spoke fluently, but not everyone was as calm. A teenager 2 rows behind muttered, "Hope the old lady doesn't have a heart attack mid-air," earning chuckles from others nearby. The laughter spread quietly, small, cruel, and ignorant. Margaret ignored them. She'd heard worse in her life, from voices far louder and skies far more dangerous. The engines roared to full power, and the aircraft lifted gracefully into the air. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, passengers settling into their seats. The business traveler beside her reclined and put on headphones. The couple behind began arguing about who got the window view. Flight attendants moved gracefully, offering water and smiles. For most people, this was just another flight. For Margaret, it was a journey back into the skies she once commanded. Her mind drifted to a younger version of herself, standing on an airfield in a leather flight jacket, wind whipping her hair, adrenaline rushing as she prepared to take off. The smell of jet fuel, the sound of engines roaring to life, the radio crackle in her ear, it all came flooding back. She'd been one of the first female test pilots in the U.S. Air Force decades ago, long before most of these passengers were even born. But time had a way of erasing history. People forgot. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Margaret opened her eyes and took a slow breath, grounding herself back in the present. The plane leveled smoothly at cruising altitude, sunlight glinting off the clouds outside. Then, without warning, the calm was shattered by a loud thud. The aircraft jolted sharply to the left. Gasps filled the cabin. A flight attendant stumbled, grabbing a seat for balance. The captain's voice came through the intercom again, this time less calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Margaret's sharp eyes darted to the wing outside. She could see the subtle change in the engine vibration. Something was off. Very off. She leaned forward, peering closely through the window, while passengers around her began whispering nervously. "What's going on? Did we hit something? Is it turbulence?" Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "That's not turbulence," the businessman next to her frowned. "What do you mean?" "The left engine's losing thrust," she said matter-of-factly, her tone eerily calm. "It's compensating too much on the starboard side. You can feel the imbalance." He stared at her, baffled. "How would you even know that?" Margaret didn't answer. She was already observing, listening, analyzing the sound like she used to in simulators decades ago. The pitch was dropping too fast and the vibrations were irregular. Something serious was happening. Then came another jolt, harder this time. The oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Screams erupted throughout the cabin. Flight attendants rushed to calm passengers, their voices trembling. Margaret's heartbeat quickened, but her expression remained composed. She'd been in worse situations. Her instincts, long buried, came roaring back. A few moments later, the captain's voice returned, strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency descent. Please stay calm and follow the crew's instructions." Margaret unbuckled her seatbelt slowly. The businessman beside her shouted, "What are you doing?" "Sit down." She ignored him, steadying herself as the plane trembled. A flight attendant rushed over, panic in her eyes. "Ma'am, please sit down. It's not safe to move right now." Margaret looked at her steadily. "Tell your captain that Margaret Hayes needs to speak to him. Immediately." The attendant blinked, confused. "Well, what?" Margaret's voice hardened, the kind of voice that used to command air crews. "Now tell him." Something in her tone, a quiet authority, made the attendant hesitate. She nodded and hurried toward the cockpit, clutching the wall for balance. Within moments, murmurs spread through the cabin. "Who is she? What's going on? Did she just say she knows the pilot?" Margaret adjusted her lapel, the golden wings glinting in the flickering light. Outside, the storm clouds loomed closer. The engines howled, the passengers prayed, and somewhere in the cockpit, a young captain was about to remember the one woman who taught him how to fly. The shrill buzz of the oxygen mask still echoed through the cabin, the fabric cords swaying gently like ghostly vines in the turbulent air. Margaret Hayes sat perfectly still amid the chaos, her hands resting on her lap, her mind sharp and focused despite the rising panic around her. The passengers were in disarray, some crying, others praying, and a few too stunned to move. A young flight attendant stumbled down the aisle, clutching the seatbacks for support. Her face was pale, fear carving lines into her usually calm expression. She knelt beside Margaret's seat. "Ma'am," she panted, "the captain says he doesn't know who you are. He's busy handling an emergency right now." Margaret turned her eyes toward her, steady and piercing. "Tell Captain Roger Dean," she said firmly, "that Commander Margaret Hayes requests permission to enter the cockpit. If he remembers his training, he'll know exactly who I am." The attendant blinked, confused and terrified, but something about the old woman's tone, that measured authority, struck her as genuine. She nodded quickly and hurried away again, disappearing behind the cockpit door. Passengers nearby stared in disbelief. The businessman beside her muttered, "Commander? What is she, some kind of retired officer?" Another man across the aisle scoffed, "Yeah, right. Probably just delusional." But their words didn't touch her. Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the clouds outside the window, now darkening with heavy storm fronts. Her years of experience told her that something far more serious than turbulence was happening. The engines weren't just struggling. They were fighting against asymmetric thrust. Moments later, the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice, strained but controlled, came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an engine malfunction on the left side. We have initiated emergency procedures. Please stay calm." Margaret closed her eyes. She could hear the uncertainty in his tone, that slight tremor hidden beneath professionalism. She had heard it before, many times, in the voices of pilots who'd never faced a real emergency. And then she heard her name. "Ms. Hayes?" the attendant's voice called over the rumble. "The captain would like to speak with you." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers turned, wide-eyed, watching as the old woman unbuckled her seatbelt and rose slowly. The businessman beside her whispered, "Wait. She's serious?" Margaret gave him a polite smile. "I always am." She steadied herself against the shaking floor, walking down the aisle with calm precision while everyone else clung to their seats. Her movements weren't that of a fragile old lady. They were controlled, confident, and graceful. The flight attendants cleared the way, their expressions a mix of fear and awe. When she reached the cockpit door, the lead attendant scanned her badge with trembling fingers and opened it just enough for her to slip inside. The heavy door shut behind her, sealing her away from the chaos of the cabin. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense. Warning lights blinked across the panels. Alarms chirped like angry birds, and both pilots were sweating under pressure. Captain Roger Dean looked up briefly, his face pale as recognition dawned on him. "Commander Hayes?" He stammered. How?" Margaret gave a small, controlled smile. "It's been a long time, Captain Dean. Let's skip the reunion and focus on that left engine." The co-pilot glanced between them, confused. "Wait, you know her?" Roger's voice was a whisper. "She trained me. Years ago, Air Force Flight Academy." Margaret leaned forward, scanning the instrument panel. Her fingers traced over the indicators with familiarity, the way a pianist feels the keys before playing. "Your left engine's compressor is surging," she said quickly. "You've lost thrust symmetry. If you keep countering manually, you'll overstress the right turbine. Pull the throttle to idle on the left and feather it, right now." The captain hesitated. "But the manual—" "Forget the manual," she snapped. "You don't have time to consult procedures when you're seconds from an uncontrolled roll. Trust your instincts. You do have those, right, Captain?" Her tone was sharp, but it cut through the panic like a blade through fog. The captain swallowed and obeyed. The moment he did, the plane steadied slightly, the violent shaking easing into a rhythmic vibration. The co-pilot exhaled shakily. "How did you—" "I've been here before," she said simply. "Different aircraft. Same problem." For a moment, silence filled the cockpit, save for the steady hum of the remaining engine. Margaret's eyes flicked across the panel, absorbing every light and dial. "You're running low on hydraulic pressure," she added. "If the backup system fails, you'll lose rudder authority. Divert to Salt Lake City, and it's the closest runway with emergency response." Roger looked at her in awe. "You still remember all of this?" Margaret allowed herself a faint smile. "You never forget the sky, Roger. It's like a song that never leaves your head." Outside, lightning flashed in the distance. The storm was closing in fast. The radar screen showed a cluster of red. Heavy turbulence ahead. The co-pilot wiped his forehead. "If we divert, we'll have to descend through that front. Then we'll thread it," Margaret said calmly. "Keep your heading at 210 and maintain altitude until we're clear of the worst." "I'll handle communications," Roger blinked. "You'll what?" Before he could protest, Margaret reached for the radio. Her hands were steady as she pressed the mic button. "Salt Lake approach, this is Flight 742 declaring an emergency. We've lost left engine thrust and are diverting due to hydraulic failure. This is Commander Margaret Hayes assisting in cockpit." The radio crackled and a startled voice responded. "Commander Hayes?" "The Margaret Hayes?" A small smile touched her lips. "The same. I'll explain later. Right now we need a clear runway and emergency crews on standby." "Copy that, Commander," the air traffic controller replied, his tone instantly respectful. "Runway 34R is cleared. You're priority one." Roger stared at her in disbelief. "They still remember you." "They should," she said softly. "I helped write their emergency protocols." Back in the cabin, the passengers had no idea that the frail old woman they had mocked minutes ago was now in the cockpit, guiding their aircraft through a storm. The businessman clutched his armrests, trembling, while the couple who had laughed earlier held hands in silence. One of the attendants whispered, "She's flying the plane." The word spread like wildfire. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into stunned realization. "She's flying it?" Someone gasped. "That old lady?" "She's not just any old lady," another replied. "They called her Commander Hayes." Outside, rain began to streak across the windows as the storm swallowed them whole. Lightning flashed again, bright, electric, and fierce, illuminating the silhouette of a woman who once ruled the skies. Inside the cockpit, Margaret's hands moved with quiet authority. She adjusted controls, guided the pilots, and issued commands in a tone that brooked no hesitation. The fear that had once filled the air began to thin, replaced by something steadier: confidence. For the first time since the emergency began, Roger's voice was calm. Hydraulics stabilizing, right engine maintaining thrust. "We might actually pull this off." Margaret glanced at him. "Not might, Captain, will." Outside, the dark clouds began to break, rays of sunlight piercing through. The storm was behind them, but the hardest part was yet to come: the landing. Roger looked at her, awe written across his face. "Commander, why are you even on this flight?" "You could have been anywhere," she smiled faintly. "I wanted to see the sky one more time before I stopped traveling." The co-pilot turned toward her, his voice soft with respect. "It seems the sky wasn't ready to let you go." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "It never is." As the aircraft began its descent toward Salt Lake City, the clouds parted fully, revealing a breathtaking stretch of sunlight and open blue sky. The passengers felt the shift and the plane was stable again. Hope replaced fear, but in the cockpit Margaret knew they weren't safe yet. The hydraulic system was weakening. The landing gear might not deploy. She tightened her grip on the control column, her voice calm and steady. "Brace yourselves," she said. "This landing will test everything you've learned, Captain Dean. Let's show them how it's done." The plane dipped gracefully, breaking through the clouds. The runway lay ahead, shimmering in sunlight like a promise. The sunlight above the clouds flickered through the cockpit windows, slicing through the tension like a blade. Margaret Hayes' hands rested lightly on the controls, her fingers moving with the precision of decades of experience. The plane, Flight 742, responded to her touch with near-perfect obedience, but the emergency was far from over. The left engine was still offline, and the hydraulic systems were weakening with each passing second. The co-pilot wiped sweat from his brow, eyes darting between warning lights and Margaret's calm demeanor. "Margaret," Captain Roger Dean began cautiously, "we're entering heavy turbulence. The autopilot is off. Are you sure we can—" "Trust me, Roger," Margaret interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "If you hesitate now, the plane will fight you, not the storm. We need harmony, not panic." He swallowed and nodded. The cabin behind them was a cacophony of fear. Passengers clinging to armrests, flight attendants trying to maintain composure, children crying softly. None of them knew that the frail old woman in row 3 had once flown supersonic jets in the dead of night, survived engine failures, and landed aircraft in conditions worse than this. Margaret's mind raced as she assessed the situation. The left engine was fully offline, the backup hydraulics were functioning at minimal capacity, and the landing gear might fail to deploy. She glanced at the instruments. Altitude 12,000 feet, airspeed 280 knots, descent angle 3.5 degrees. The runway at Salt Lake City International Airport was 25 miles away. It was doable. With careful management, they could land safely. She turned to Roger. "I need you to stabilize the plane manually on a heading of 220. Keep the nose level. Don't fight the yaw. Let me guide the descent." Roger's eyes widened, but he complied, hands trembling slightly. Margaret adjusted the throttles, feathering the left engine and maintaining just enough power on the right to balance lift. The plane shuddered, buffeted by the storm outside, but gradually it responded. "Brace for sudden pitch," she warned, glancing at the co-pilot. "It's going to feel like we're tipping over, but stay focused." Lightning flashed across the storm clouds, illuminating the cockpit in stark white brilliance. Outside, rain streaked against the windows like a curtain of liquid silver. Margaret's gaze never wavered from the instruments. She could feel every vibration, every subtle change in airflow. Her body, though aged, moved with the instincts of a pilot at her peak. "Passengers are secured," the co-pilot reported, voice shaking. "Oxygen masks are still deployed. Cabin pressure stable, but the storm is intensifying." Margaret nodded, processing the data. "Good, that's manageable. Roger, adjust flaps to 15 degrees. Co-pilot, monitor hydraulic pressure and fuel mix. I'll guide us visually on the final approach." She leaned slightly forward, peering through the windshield at the storm ahead. The runway lights were barely visible through the thick sheets of rain, but she could make them out. Faint beacons cutting through the chaos. Every instinct told her this landing required finesse, timing, and nerves of steel. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The plane dipped and shuddered, each roll and pitch threatening to throw them off balance. Behind them, passengers were silent now, sensing the gravity of the moment. Even the murmurs had ceased. Fear had been replaced by awe. Flap set, Roger confirmed, voice steadying slightly. Margaret's hands moved fluidly over the controls, guiding the descent with calculated precision. The landing gear indicators flickered. Amber for a moment, then green. Margaret's sharp eyes tracked the hydraulics, and with a subtle adjustment, the gear locked into place. "Landing gear secured," she announced. "We're ready for approach." Outside, the storm began to break. Sunlight pierced through gaps in the clouds, reflecting off the wet tarmac ahead. Margaret guided the plane through the turbulent air, feeling every gust, every pressure change. The runway grew larger in her view, a narrow strip of salvation amid chaos. "Roger, align with centerline," she instructed. "Co-pilot, maintain 140 knots. Smooth descent." "This is going to be tricky. The crosswinds are stronger than they appear." The plane trembled violently as a gust hit its side. Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a command from a drill sergeant. "Counter left. Steady now." "Steady! Hold!" The co-pilot adjusted, the plane responding under Margaret's precise guidance. She could see the runway clearly now. Her hands danced over the throttles and yoke, micro-adjusting constantly. Every fiber of her being focused solely on bringing Flight 742 safely down. Inside the cabin, passengers gripped their seats, some whispering prayers, others frozen in awe as the stormy skies began to part, revealing the illuminated runway ahead. The business traveler who had mocked her hours ago whispered under his breath, "I can't believe she's doing this." Margaret's voice rang firm and clear through the cockpit. Eyes on the runway. Visual glide path confirmed. "Adjust flaps to 25 degrees. Steady. Steady." The plane shuddered once more as the wind hit its side, but the wheels touched down with a gentle jolt, rolling along the wet tarmac. Margaret guided it smoothly to a stop, using differential braking and remaining hydraulic pressure to keep control. Applause erupted from the cabin. Some clapping, some cheering, all overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. Roger Dean sat back, pale and shaking, staring at Margaret in disbelief. You saved us," he said finally. Margaret smiled faintly, exhaustion and satisfaction mingling in her expression. "We saved each other, Captain." "The plane, the passengers?" "We worked as one." The co-pilot, still in awe, nodded silently. I've never seen anyone do that, ever." Outside, emergency crews approached the plane, sirens blaring, but the storm had passed. The sky was calm, sunlight reflecting off puddles on the runway. Margaret looked out the window, her face serene. The storm was over, and she had reminded everyone aboard, and perhaps herself, that experience. Courage and calm in the face of danger were timeless. Passengers filed out, some rushing to thank her, others staring in disbelief. Margaret adjusted her glasses and handbag, moving down the aisle with quiet dignity. She hadn't sought recognition. She had simply done what the sky demanded. But as she walked past the passengers, whispers followed her. That was her. Row 3, she saved the plane. I can't believe we laughed at her. Margaret gave a faint, knowing smile. Some things never changed. People doubted, people mocked, until reality proved them wrong. And in this case, reality had just taken flight. The plane had touched down. The wet tarmac reflected the sunlight breaking through the storm, shimmering like a mirror beneath the massive aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Margaret Hayes's hands lingered lightly on the controls, making minute adjustments as the plane slowed along the runway. Every movement, every touch was precise, a dance of experience and instinct. The tires screeched lightly against the damp asphalt, and the passengers were already beginning to feel the shift from panic to relief. Brake pressure stable, the co-pilot reported, voice trembling but calm. Hydraulics holding, we're slowing effectively. Margaret nodded. Good. Keep it steady. Smooth. Hold the nose level. Captain Roger Dean exhaled slowly, still staring at her in disbelief. You've just done what? I've never seen anyone handle an emergency like that, Margaret. She allowed herself a faint smile. It's what we trained for, Roger. Remember those simulations in the old hangar at Edwards? Every emergency we prepared for, every failure scenario. It all comes down to one thing. staying calm and thinking ahead. Outside, emergency vehicles lined the runway, lights flashing in red and blue ready to respond to any complication. But none was necessary. Flight 742 had landed safely, against all odds, thanks to the calm and precise hands of a woman most passengers had mocked just minutes earlier. The plane rolled to a stop near the gate. Margaret guided it expertly using differential braking and rudder corrections to align perfectly. The engines powered down gradually, the cabin lights returning to normal. A collective cheer erupted from the passengers. People clapped, some even standing in the aisles, faces alight with awe and gratitude. Back in row 3, the young businessman who had whispered cruel comments earlier stood, mouth agape. I can't believe that was her, he stammered. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by stunned respect. The flight attendants quickly moved to secure the cabin and help passengers deboard safely. One of them, her eyes wide with admiration, whispered to a colleague, That was Commander Margaret Hayes. The real deal. Margaret stood, adjusting her glasses and handbag with quiet dignity. She didn't rush, didn't seek attention. Her calm, measured movements contrasted sharply with the chaos and panic that had dominated the cabin only moments ago. Passengers began to approach her. Some wanted photos. Others simply wanted to shake the hand of the woman who had saved them all. The businessman who had mocked her now bowed his head in respect. I'm so sorry, he muttered. I had no idea. Margaret offered a small, kind smile. No harm done. Just remember, never underestimate anyone. Appearances are often deceiving. Captain Dean entered the cabin moments later, escorted by the flight attendants. His face was a mix of astonishment and gratitude. Margaret, he said, his voice firm and steady now. I should have recognized you sooner, but no one else could have handled this. You saved everyone on this plane. Passengers murmured, leaning in to hear. She's the commander? Whispered one. She trained him? Asked another. Margaret nodded, acknowledging the whispers. Many years ago, she said softly. It's been a long time since I flew professionally, but some skills never fade. The sky remembers you, even when the world doesn't. The passengers erupted into applause again, this time more heartfelt. Tears glistened in the eyes of several, including families who had feared the worst just minutes ago. Margaret allowed herself to feel the warmth of their gratitude but kept her composure. This was not about recognition, it was about the sky, about precision, about duty. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, Mom, did she really fly the plane herself? Her mother nodded, smiling. Yes, sweetheart. And she saved everyone. Margaret began to walk toward the jet bridge. Passengers gave way instinctively, some following her gaze, others craning their necks to catch a final glimpse of the woman who had taken charge and brought them safely home. At the exit, emergency personnel approached, ready to assist, but Margaret waved them off politely. I'm fine, thank you. Outside, sunlight bathed the runway, drying the puddles from the storm. Margaret paused for a moment, looking up at the sky she had commanded once again. A soft breeze brushed her face, and for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to remember the thrill of flight, the roar of engines, the freedom of open skies. Captain Dean caught up with her just as she prepared to step onto the tarmac. Margaret, the passengers are calling you a hero, he said. I don't even know how to properly thank you. She smiled gently, adjusting her handbag. No thanks needed. The sky never asks for gratitude. It only demands respect and attention. Remember that, Roger. As she walked away from the plane, passengers began to whisper excitedly, recounting what they had witnessed. News crews already prepared cameras, recognizing the story for what it was. A true miracle in the air. Margaret had been underestimated, mocked, and ignored, until she reminded everyone that courage, experience, and calm authority were timeless. The boarding gate filled with murmurs of admiration. She's amazing. Did you see her take over? I want to meet her. Margaret's eyes twinkled faintly as she disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a plane, passengers, and crew who would never forget Row 3, the seat where an old woman had turned the tide of fate and commanded the skies once more. The airport terminal buzzed with a mix of awe, disbelief, and excitement. Word of Flight 742's harrowing emergency had spread quickly through social media, aviation forums, and local news. Screens displayed images of the aircraft that had landed flawlessly despite the left engine failure, while headlines flashed, "Miraculous landing, passengers saved by unexpected hero." Yet few knew the full story, that the calm, silver-haired woman in Row 3 had been the one orchestrating their survival from the cockpit. Margaret Hayes moved through the crowd with quiet composure, her handbag swinging gently at her side. Every so often, someone recognized her and gasped in realization. Whispers followed her like a trail. "That's her. She's the pilot." Row 3. She saved the plane. Inside the terminal, Captain Roger Dean approached her, still pale but visibly composed. His face carried the respect and reverence of someone who had just witnessed a legend in action. "Margaret," he said, voice steady but edged with awe, "I can't believe you're here. I should have called you sooner. You saved everyone on that flight, the passengers, the crew, myself. I don't even know what to say." Margaret offered a small, calm smile. "You don't need to say anything, Roger. The plane, the passengers, the crew, they all did exactly what they needed to. I merely guided them." Roger shook his head. "Guided? You practically took over the plane in mid-flight. You risked your life and their lives, all to save people who didn't even know who you were. You was trained to respond in moments like this." Margaret interrupted gently, her voice firm but kind. "The sky doesn't care about appearances, titles, or age. It only respects preparation, calm judgment, and experience. That's what I gave today." The passengers were still milling around the jet bridge, many approaching her now, some with tears in their eyes. One young woman held her hands together, trembling. I can't believe you were Row 3, she whispered. "I laughed at you earlier." "I'm so sorry." Margaret nodded, her expression serene. "It's all right. Now you know not to judge by appearances. Strength, courage, and capability are not always visible at first glance." A journalist from a local news channel approached her with a microphone. "Ms. Hayes, can you tell us how it feels to have saved Flight 742 today?" Margaret paused, her blue eyes glinting with a quiet, seasoned wisdom. "It doesn't feel like I saved anyone. I merely did what was necessary. The passengers, the crew, the pilots, everyone followed their instincts, their training, and my guidance. This was a team effort. The sky only tests you to see if you can rise to the occasion, and today we all did." The journalist, sensing the depth behind her words, nodded respectfully. "But surely you knew the danger." "The risk?" She smiled faintly. "The risk is always there in aviation. What matters is how you respond when it arises. Fear is natural. Control, focus, and calm make the difference between disaster and survival." Social media had already exploded. Videos taken by passengers showed glimpses of Margaret moving down the aisle, the oxygen masks dangling, and her calm demeanor in the storm. Memes, reactions, and tributes poured in. But the real story was the awe of experience versus underestimation. People realized that the woman they had mocked moments ago was not just competent, she was legendary. The airport PA system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to recognize a passenger from Flight 742, Ms. Margaret Hayes, for her bravery and expertise during today's emergency landing." The crowd erupted into applause. Margaret, still composed, gave a slight nod, acknowledging the recognition without letting it define her. She had not sought fame, only duty, and today the world had been reminded that true capability transcends expectation. Captain Dean followed her outside, gesturing toward the gathered passengers. "Everyone here needs to hear this. Margaret Hayes is a former test pilot decorated for her service and one of the most skilled aviators alive today. She trained me and countless others, and today, she reminded all of us why experience matters." The passengers erupted again, some crying, some clapping, all now fully aware of the woman they had once underestimated. The young businessman who had mocked her on the flight stepped forward, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe I laughed at you," he admitted, his voice shaky. "You're incredible." Margaret smiled faintly. We all learn lessons in unexpected ways. News cameras captured her calm demeanor as reporters asked questions, but Margaret remained composed, her words steady and deliberate. Never underestimate the power of preparation. Never doubt the value of experience. And never judge anyone by their appearance. Today was about teamwork, focus, and rising to the occasion, qualities that belong to anyone willing to meet the challenge. The passengers began to disperse, some lingering to shake her hand, others documenting the moment on their phones. Margaret walked toward the terminal exit, her head held high, calm and dignified. She had reminded a world too quick to judge that capability is often hidden in plain sight. Outside, the sunlight reflected off the runway, and the sky was clear now, calm and expansive. Margaret paused briefly, looking at the horizon. The storm had passed, but the lessons endured. Bravery isn't always visible, wisdom is timeless, and even the quietest voices can command the skies when it matters most. And with that, Margaret Hayes disappeared into the crowd, an unassuming hero whose story would be remembered long after the headlines faded. The world had seen her, underestimated her, and finally, fully recognized her brilliance. Row 3 would never be forgotten.